Morning. I'm in the dye studio this morning, and I'm going to do a series of videos over the next week or so regarding sock knitting. This is actually a sock that I produced a while ago with all my last bits and pieces from other sock yarn, which has worked out really beautifully. So at the moment we've got a lovely sale on of our Blueface Leicester sock yarn. So if you'd like to get yourself some sock yarn, then please do go on our website and have a look at all the lovely colours. It's all naturally dyed. This is Blueface Leicester pure wool. It is super wash, so even though it is pure wool, it will go in the washing machine. And it's just a beautiful soft yarn that makes a delicious pair of socks. A lovely gift, a lovely gift. So what I want to do just this morning for the first video is to get you going on a pair of socks. First of all, you need some sock yarn. So like this, and all our sock yarn comes in a hank, which is what I'm going to be talking about today, on how to get it from a hank into a ball of wool. What else do you need? You need some knitting needles, double pointed knitting needles. Now, there are various sizes knitting needles. For something like a 4-ply yarn, I use a 2.75mm yarn. I also use wood ones or bamboo, mainly because they're allowed on an aeroplane. I know we're not flying much at the moment, but that's my stash. I also use the longer ones. So these ones are 20 centimetres long. So probably quite long for a sock needle, and I know that my friend Paula, she knits a huge amount of socks, and she works on the smaller version, which I think are 15 centimetres, more like that kind of length. Why do I use the longer ones? I think I like them because there's a feeling that the stitches won't fall off the needle quite so much as if it was a shorter one. I think at the end of the day, once you've learnt anything, it's all about personal preference rather than what you should or shouldn't do. So it's about exploring and experimenting with what suits you best. The other thing is that I always buy them in packs. In fact, these ones, which are Knit Pro ones, come in a pack of 6. I use 5 needles to knit socks on. These come in a pack of 6, and I always make sure that I have at least 2 sets of needles, because unfortunately they have a tendency to either fall off or bing off while you're knitting, and they incredibly so disappear in a blink of an eye. So to always have a spare set of needles with you when you're sock knitting stops that frustration that if you lose one while you're in the middle of a project, you've always got somewhere to go to. So that's my recommendation. Obviously, I think that once you've got going with sock knitting, you kind of fall into your own pattern and your own way of using things. But that's what I do. I will come back later as to why I knit on 5 needles rather than 4, and we'll talk about that in the next video. What I want to do today, and I've been dying to do this actually for a while, is to talk about how to get this into a ball of wool. So why do we indie dyers and other dyers sell in the skein and not the ball? For 2 reasons really. In fact, funnily enough, Harry, he asked me the same question yesterday when he was looking at one of my trial videos. And the reason is, one, it keeps the price down. As an indie dyer, spooling up yarn is very time consuming, and yes, there are certain yarns that I will put into a cake simply because I think it looks better in a cake and presents nicer in a cake, but sock yarn I think works nicer in a hank or a skein, whatever you want to call it, simply because you can actually see what it looks like. You don't necessarily know what that will knit up like, but you can get a good feel for actually all the detail that's in there. Okay, this particular one that I'm showing you here is I call it a Shibori cochineal one. So it's been dyed in cochineal, but I've done a bit of a tie dye. So when it's gone in the pot, I've just put a tie in the knot. So there's part of it that hasn't taken the dye, it's resisted the dye. So you get a lovely, so what I'm anticipating will happen is I will get a kind of a spiral stripe through the sock. It's not so clear on that one, the spiral sock, but it is. That's a spiral stripe. It isn't self-striping. I don't know. It's more random than that, and I like randomness rather than matching pairs. But again, you know, there's a whole world out there of matching pairs of socks. So, what you will need: one of these, which is actually 110 grams. Most hanks come in about 100 grams. You'll need one of those to make a pair of socks. And actually, one of those will make a really big, decent pair of socks. So it even fits my brother-in-law's massive size 12 or whatever he is, pair of feet. But equally so, it will also fit my lovely size 6 feet with leftovers. And actually, this was produced with all my leftover yarn. So yeah, that's kind of how much leftover you have with a pair of 6. So to give you an idea of the amount of yarn that you will need. So, moving from a hank, so first of all, I'm going to undo this hank, take the label off. Okay, so that's a hank of yarn. And what I've done is I've tied, there should be 2 ends on there tied. So the ends are tied round, which are very useful. But what is really important is that you keep that hank in its hank. So try not to get that muddled. So as soon as you release the ends, don't put it down without making sure that you've got that as a hank in its right place. So I'm just going to break the yarn there so I know that that's an end, and then the other end, which is there, I'm just going to break that as well. Okay, so I've now got 2 ends. Okay, the thing is with these hanks, it's really easy, especially this 4-ply yarn, to get into a massive pickle. And I'm not guaranteeing that actually this is going to work beautifully today. I have no idea. What really does help is some equipment. So I've got a big nice umbrella swivel here that I use mainly, but I've also got a small one that I keep at home for when I find myself at home with a hank and I want to do something. And again, this one works just as nice. It's a bit more fragile, but it's actually quite sweet and quite lovely, and I do appreciate that one as well. I'm going to work on my big swivel today because it makes more sense to do that. So I'm going to put it up. And it is, I have to admit, that if you're working a lot with hanks, it is worth investing in equipment because it does take a lot of the frustration away. Having said that, when I'm travelling, I found myself in airports with hanks of yarn that have not been balled up, and I sit there quite quietly with the hank in front of me and winding it off. If I've got somebody who will hold it for me, that helps. I've even ended up putting it around my knees and different things, but it does, by the time you get towards the end, it can end up in a bit of a pickle, which can be a bit frustrating. So equipment is what you need, really. So I'm going to make sure that remains in its hank, but before I put it on, what I think is a really good thing to do is give it a good, you can hear it thing, because it tends to sort it out a little bit. Now, one of the main things that I will say is the less you fiddle with it, the easier it is. So if in the beginning it gets a bit muddled and you start pulling it through, it becomes more of a pickle later on. I'll show you what I mean. So I'm going to put this on now. I need to just tighten that back up again. Okay. And I've got one of my ends. Okay. The other thing that I have is a wool winder. Now I'm just going to move this back a little bit so that it fits, so you can see my wool winder. Okay. So I've got a little hand one. I do have a, is that going to fit in there? Yeah. So you'll see the ball going on. Move that back side. Oh my. There we go. So you've got your two ends. So one of those ends you've got to fit somewhere that's not going to drag down. So, in fact, right now I can't find my other end, so I'm not going to worry about it. But what I am going to do is just unwind some before it gets caught up, and that's going really nicely. If you do have another end, which I do somewhere, but it's not showing itself at this minute, it will pop out eventually. Just make sure that you attach it somewhere on there so it doesn't get caught round the middle post. So because that's unwound really nicely, I'm going to start winding it on. We're really lucky because it's coming off really nicely. If, for example, it suddenly started getting caught somewhere, the worst thing you could actually do is start then feeding that through and trying to unwind it, unless of course it was a massive pickle, and occasionally you will get a skein of yarn that causes you a lot of trouble, but most of the time these will come off really, really easily. But the worst thing you can do is start feeding it through. The best thing you need to do is just to start opening up the skein, and you'll find that magically it will actually just adjust itself. If you start to try and solve a problem now, it will affect it later. So there's no getting around it. You've just got to trust in the fact that actually it will work out okay. So there you go, that's the classic one that was just caught there. But instead of doing anything about it, I'm just going to open up, and as you can see it's now coming from the middle of the, so I'm just going to open that up so that I'm not going to feed that through, I'm just going to open it up. So I'm just going to tease it, that's a nice word. Another one. So there's a classic one. You could actually decide to take the ball off and feed that through, but I'd say don't. Just keep on trusting. And there's my other end. Look, at the moment, it's not causing me any problems. So I think what I'll do, I'll have a go at putting it through on there, just so that it's out the way. And I will, yeah, that's fine. Any problems. I have to admit my arm is aching because I'm actually rushing through to get this done. I have got an electrical wool winder, but for this particular project I think it's better for the hand because you've got more control. With the electric one it just goes on and on and on. You have to be quick to get the flick off, the switch off in case it gets into a pickle. Here's another. Again, just tease it out gently. My finger caught there, that's all right. I'm holding it out and giving it a little bit of tension, and possibly that's too much tension because that feels quite tight, that ball. But I've just got more control on it. Nearly there. Slow down as you come to the end. Last bit. And here we have, yeah, that's quite a tight ball that I've got on there. And here we have our yarn. It's not perfect cake by any means. I've got a bit of overflow going on in the middle there. And what I might do, so it makes it a nicer cake, is actually rewind that on. But there you go. So when you start knitting, what you will do is take it from the middle there. Now obviously it looks like I've got a bit of a pickle going on here. For some reason it didn't work out properly around the end. But that's still very usable. I am going to try and find that middle one, if it's in there at all. Might be easier to get it from the other side. There it is. And I'm going to rewind that on to make a nicer ball. I won't bore you with that right now. I'll come back to you when that's done. All right, see you in the next episode when we'll start casting on to create our socks. Okay, thanks, bye.